好 cam 啦。三位望一望呢邊啊，呢邊係你哋嘅右手邊，唔該晒，唔該。可唔可以近少少個電視位置啊？唔該晒。好，到咗呢一邊。三個呢度啊，三個呢度嘅，好。好。
首先歡迎大家出席。
Welcome to the press conference today. With us today are Mr. Adolf Lang, government economist, and to his right we have Mr. Desmond Ho, deputy government economist, and to his left Miss Wendy Hong, assistant commissioner for census and statistics. Mr. Lang will first brief us on the latest GDP and price forecast for 2022 in Chinese and English, and then we will proceed to questions and answers. Good afternoon. Welcome to the press conference. Today, I will brief you on the economic situation in the first quarter and the latest GDP and price forecast for 2022. First of all, highlights. In the first quarter this year, both exports and local economic activities weakened sharply, and that's why the Hong Kong economy saw a marked deterioration and contracted by 4% year-on-year. The unemployment rate also increased notably. Looking forward, persisting tension in Ukraine and expedited monetary policy tightening by major central banks to curb inflation will dampen global economic outlook, which may continue to weigh on our export performance. Nonetheless, cross-boundary transportation disruptions may gradually ease and provide some relief. The receding local epidemic and progressive relaxation of social distancing measures, along with the government's various support measures, will help the revival of domestic demand. Having considered all circumstances, we have revised real GDP growth forecast for 2022 downward to 1 to 2%. Like I said, the Hong Kong economy saw a marked deterioration in Q1, and on the graph on the left, you can see that there's a year-on-year contraction of 4%. The seasonally adjusted quarter-to-quarter change in GDP is 3% or minus 3%. And for the graph on the right, these are the main expenditure components. For exports of goods and services, private consumption expenditure, and gross domestic fixed capital formation all recorded declines to different extents. In terms of the external environment, the global economic growth momentum slowed in the first quarter. Inflation has been rife, and that leads to a slowdown in demand growth, and the major central banks had to expedite the tightening of monetary policy, which would further affect the economy. Meanwhile, the Omicron strain has spread, and it had an effect on different regions. It affected economic activities and affected sentiments as well. And in the latter part of Q1, geopolitical tensions heightened, and that further affected the economic growth impetus globally. This graph shows the annualized quarter-to-quarter rate of change among different major economies, and the US saw an improvement and then a decline, while the Euro area saw a slight growth before seeing a slowdown. And the mainland economy also saw a slowdown, and in March the performance deteriorated. Apart from a slowdown in global economic growth, locally speaking, the COVID-19 pandemic was austere in the first quarter, and in February and March, cross-boundary transportation between Hong Kong and the mainland was severely disrupted. In terms of the volume of cross-boundary trucks, it went from 16,000 per day to about only 4,000 per day. And these factors contributed to a quarter-to-quarter change of minus 4.5%. Exports to the mainland declined by 13.4% in the first quarter. For other markets, including the US, EU, and major Asian markets, exports saw a growth, but the rate has slowed down. Likewise, exports of services also contracted. Here we can see the exports of different services or components. Most of them recorded a decline in the first quarter, including transport, financial services, as well as business and other services. For travel services, we saw a year-on-year growth, but it has remained at a low level. The current level is only some 6% of the pre-recession level. In terms of the domestic sector, the local epidemic situation was austere in the first quarter, and social distancing measures were implemented, and these seriously disrupted consumption activities. And due to a deteriorating labor market, consumption sentiments were further hit, and we saw a year-on-year decline of 5.5% in private consumption expenditure. Earlier, the CNSD published statistics on retail volume and revenue. At that time, we already saw that private expenditure would see a slump, and the expenditure declined by 14% or 25.4%, and the year-on-year decline widened to 8.8% due to a worsening business sentiment. We saw that there was a decline of 14% in expenditure on machinery, equipment, and intellectual property products. In terms of building and construction expenditure, we saw a slight decline overall. The decline in private expenditure offset the growth in public expenditure. In the first quarter, the labor market was under severe pressure. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rate grew from 4% in the first quarter last year to 5% this Q1, and it reversed a downtrend. And the unemployment rate among higher and lower skilled workers both increased. Underemployment rate also climbed from 1.7% to 3.1%. We saw that unemployment among most sectors increased, especially travel and consumption-related sectors, which is easy enough to understand since these are sectors most affected by the pandemic and social distancing measures. That's why we saw a surge in their unemployment rates. For retail, accommodation, and food services sectors, unemployment rate rebounded to 8.9%. Food and beverage service activities sector rebounded to as much as 11%. Now I'd like to talk about inflation. Inflationary pressure grew further in Q1, but overall inflation remained moderate in overall terms. The underlying consumer price index went up by 1.6% this year, which is higher than 1.2% in the preceding quarter. When we look at the different components, we saw that basic food costs or prices picked up visibly due to epidemic-induced temporary supply disruptions. For energy-related items, as well as clothing and footwear, they also recorded notable increases. Price pressures on other major components were broadly in check. Private rentals continue to see a decline.
Turning now to the property market. In Q1, the market sentiments were affected by the tightening of the monetary policy by the Fed and the pandemic. So in Q1 2022, the property market remained soft with subdued trading, and S&P agreements dropped down to about 10,000, and this is lowest level since Q4 2018. From December to March this year, the prices have dropped by 3%. In March 2022, the average of the property prices compared with September 2021, there has been a cumulative drop of 4%. From the market information, in the second half of March, the transaction has increased, and it remains robust. And over the past couple of months, the prices have dropped. In Q1, the property prices have dropped. If you look at the index of home purchase affordability, it is 71%, which is a pretty high level. It shows that the property prices are not commensurate with the purchasing or affordability and purchasing power. Let me turn now to the outlook for the rest of 2022. Externally, the global economic outlook has worsened. The Ukraine situation remains tense, and this will keep the international energy and commodity prices elevated, and this will also aggravate supply chain and transportation disruptions and dampen economic sentiment. In the face of mounting inflation, many of the central banks are expected to accelerate their monetary policy tightening. The changing global pandemic and the development of the China-US relations will add further uncertainties. All these factors taken together will affect the export performance in Hong Kong. However, with the pandemic receding and the cross-boundary transportation disruptions may gradually ease, and this will provide some relief to exports. The upcoming two slides are illustrations of what I said. The Ukraine situation is taking a toll on energy and commodity prices, and also natural gas. To the left of the slide, we see the natural gas, wheat, and energy. The fluctuations are pretty severe, but compared with the situation before the Ukraine crisis, the oil prices have gone up by 10%, natural gas and wheat up by 30–40%. The chart on the right shows the freight cost, which remains elevated. Now here, we can see that inflation in Europe and the US may stay high throughout the year, and the consumer price index is 8.3% in March, which is pretty high, and in Eurozone 7.5%. According to some private analysts, inflation in the US will stand at 7.2% and in the US and 6.8% in Eurozone. The high inflation rate will lead to a tightening of the monetary policy and also contribute to poor performance in the economy. IMF back in April revised downwards the global economic growth in 2022 to 3.6%. Now here, from this diagram, we can see the IMF forecast in April compared with 2021 actual economic performance. It is lower. Other than Japan, all the other economic entities register slower growth. The second thing we can see is, by comparison with the January forecast, the April forecast also was revised downward. So the situation is worse than last year, and also worse than the earlier forecast for this year. Locally, starting from March, we have seen an easing of the local epidemic, and the social distancing curbs were progressively relaxed, and this is conducive to the revival of domestic demand. We have seen some revival. In fact, some April figures are not available yet, but if you look at the flow of people, and we can use the Google Mobility Index for this purpose. And if we look at the sectoral factors in the media reports, we can see that over the past month or so, the economic activities and demand are reviving domestically. If the pandemic remains under control, the domestic demand will revive. We mentioned the April figures are not available yet, but we do have some figures regarding the business sentiment. The PMI has risen to 51.7%, which is above the threshold of 50. For the SMEs, the sentiment is also getting better. The diffusion index has gone up to 48.3, which is much higher than the earlier 29.9%. In terms of inflation, the global prices remain elevated, and the Ukraine crisis pushed up the commodity and energy prices, and we believe that the import prices will remain elevated for Hong Kong. However, in terms of the costs locally, they remain moderate. Like some commercial rentals, they remain soft, and the wage increase remain moderate. So overall, in terms of inflation, it would remain moderate in the near term. However, there are certain components that will experience higher growth rate, and this is going to be visible.
主要就係總結翻我頭先嗰大約6-7張 slides 講嘅嘢，咁而
This is a summary of the last 6 or 7 slides, so I won't repeat what's been said. Finally, having considered all the above factors, we have adjusted the economic forecast for 2022 from 2 to 3.5% as announced in the budget to the latest 1 to 2%. The underlying inflation forecast remains at 2%. Now I would use English to summarize some of the key points I covered.
everyone. I'm now going to summarize the key points in English. The Hong Kong economy saw a marked deterioration in the first quarter. Real GDP contracted by 4% from a year earlier, reversing the growth trend in the previous 4 quarters. Externally, slower global demand growth and epidemic-induced disruptions to cross-boundary transportation posed significant drags to exports. Domestically, the local epidemic and restrictive measures weighed heavily on a wide range of economic activities as well as economic sentiment. Compared to the fourth quarter of last year, real GDP fell 3.0% after seasonal adjustment. Goods exports worsened abruptly and fell by 4.5% year-on-year in real terms in the first quarter. Exports to the mainland turned to a sharp fall, while those to the US, EU, and other major markets in Asia recorded moderated growth. Services exports contracted by 2.8% as global economic growth decelerated, cargo movements shrank, and cross-border financial and fundraising activities softened. Domestic demand weakened markedly. Private consumption expenditure turned to a decline of 5.5% in real terms from a year earlier, amid a drastic fall in people flow and deteriorating labor market conditions. Overall investment expenditure saw an enlarged decline of 8.4% as business sentiment worsened. The labor market was under severe pressure. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rate rose notably from 4.0% in fourth quarter of 2021 to 5% in the first quarter this year, reversing the downtrend since early 2021. The unemployment rates of most major sectors increased, particularly those of the consumption and tourism-related sectors, the arts, entertainment and recreation sector, and the construction sector. Underlying consumer price inflation went up to 1.6% in the first quarter. Prices of basic food picked up visibly amid epidemic-induced temporary disruptions to supply. Prices of energy-related items, as well as clothing and footwear, also recorded notable increases. Nonetheless, price pressures on other major components were broadly in check. I will now turn to our latest economic forecast. Global economic prospects have worsened, which may continue to weigh on Hong Kong's export performance. Persisting tension in Ukraine will likely keep international energy and commodity prices elevated and aggravate disruptions to supply chains and transportation. At the same time, major central banks are expected to expedite their monetary policy tightening in light of rising inflation. The evolving global pandemic and development of China-US relations will add further uncertainties. However, cross-boundary transportation disruptions between the mainland and Hong Kong may gradually ease, alongside the improving local epidemic situation, providing some relief to our external trade. Domestically, economic activities should see some revival going forward, alongside the receding local epidemic and progressive relaxation of social distancing measures. The government's various support measures, including the new round of the Consumption Voucher Scheme, the 2022 Employment Support Scheme, and the Temporary Unemployment Relief Scheme, will render additional support. Taking into account the worse than expected performance in the first quarter and the deteriorating export outlook, but also considering the expected gradual revival of local economic activities, the real GDP growth forecast for 2022 is revised down to 1 to 2%, from 2 to 3.5% as announced in the budget. On inflation, external price pressures may remain elevated as inflation in many major economies remains high. Nonetheless, overall inflation should remain moderate in the near term as domestic cost pressures are staying largely mild. The forecast rate of underlying consumer price inflation for 2022 is maintained at 2%. We are now happy to take questions.
好，而家答問環節。
Now we proceed to questions and answers. Please identify your organization before you speak. The gentleman on the fourth row, please. This is Phoenix TV. In recent days, we saw that major global economies, including the US, have taken out interest rate hikes, and the global economic slowdown, would it have a compass on Hong Kong? If Hong Kong follows the interest rate hikes of the US, what impact will there be on the local economy? In terms of relaxation of social distancing measures, it would boost domestic demand together with the electronic consumption vouchers. Do you expect a rebound in the quarter-to-quarter GDP? And how much do you expect it to grow? Globally speaking, many economies have taken interest rate hikes, including the US. The hikes have come rather rapidly, and the cumulative increase has been 0.57% already. The rate hikes would hamper the growth of global economies, or in other words, it could lead to a slowdown in growth, and inevitably exports performance of Hong Kong would be affected. That is why I said that the dampening global economic outlook would affect Hong Kong. One reason for the poor performance in exports in the first quarter was that cross-boundary transportation between Hong Kong and the mainland was severely disrupted as the pandemic in Hong Kong gradually eases. We hope that such disruptions would recede and provide support to our exports. And in terms of rate hikes in Hong Kong under the linked exchange rate system, if the US raises interest rates, Hong Kong inevitably would follow. And with the rapid hikes taken out by the US, we saw that the exchange rate between Hong Kong dollar and US dollar have reached a threshold, and that's why rate hikes in Hong Kong might take place more rapidly compared with before, and that could dampen demand, and the rate hikes could also affect asset prices. If the mortgage rate goes up by 1%, for someone who is repaying mortgages, the monthly repayment would go up by 13 to 14% under the current circumstances. So these are areas we must keep tabs on, and we will continue to monitor the situation. What is important is that we must pay attention to these cyclical changes. But we do not believe that the rate hikes would pose systemic risks for Hong Kong as an economy. So our current account remains very healthy. All our external accounts for goods and services still sees a surplus. The government's finances remain healthy, and we still have a substantial surplus. Our foreign exchange reserve is equivalent to some 30% of M3, and our banking system remains robust. So as a whole, we can weather such challenges, and we would not be affected by any systemic risks. And together with external investment and the consumption vouchers, our domestic consumption demand will see a stimulation. Before the consumption vouchers were rolled out early this year, we estimated that the consumption vouchers would boost or provide a buffer of 1 to 1.5% to the GDP. That was our projection.
Next gentleman in front, please. RTHK. Now, there are some economists who forecast that in Q2, the economy will contract by 0.5 to 0.7% because most of the time there were social distancing measures and also the pandemic. Do you foresee further contraction if we experience 2 quarters of contraction in Hong Kong? Does it mean that Hong Kong is approaching a technical recession? Unemployment, now we have seen a relaxation of the social distancing measures. Do you think that the unemployment rate in April will peak? And also the Hong Kong exchange rate. Now we have touched the weak side of the trading band. The rate hikes in the US are happening pretty fast. Is there any indication of capital outflow? Now we have seen a weak IPO scenario. do we see a large-scale capital outflow out of Hong Kong? In Q2, right, when I mentioned the forecast, I've already touched on this. Basically, in terms of export, the impact is greater because of the worsening global economic situation. However, it is likely that the cross-boundary transportation will be getting better, and that would provide some sort of a buffer. In terms of domestic demands, as the pandemic is under control and the social distancing measures are relaxed, we should see a revival of the domestic demand. Overall, we have to have regard to two things, which one would play a bigger role. In the coming quarters, the economy will be progressively reviving. As to whether it's going to be in positive or negative territory, it would depend very much on the pace of recovery going forward. So at this point in time, it will be hard for us to say categorically that it's going to be going up or going down. But the momentum shows that the next quarter is going to be better than this quarter. You mentioned technical recession. We believe that things will be getting better quarter by quarter, and this is not a significant issue to contend with. In terms of the jobless rate, the level of joblessness would hinge on the economic situation. In the remaining quarters of this year, the economy will be recovering, in particular in terms of domestic demand. There will be more people being employed as a result. If this projection is correct, i.e. the economy for the coming quarters will be recovering in terms of economic activities, then the jobless rate will progressively be going down. Next week, we're going to have the jobless rate for February to April. The unemployment rate is an average of 3 quarters. So there will be a bit of a time lag. Now, in the 3 months covered, and maybe 2 months, they have not started recovering, so there will be a bit of a time lag. We're not sure whether the number will go down. There may be an increase. There was in February that the economy dipped in March, end of March and April. Things became better. Now for March to May, is it likely that it will go sideways or it will go down? I think there is a likelihood that it will go down. You mentioned the exchange rate. I think the whole design, this is the whole design of the currency peg. When the U.S. is hiking the interest rate, there will be carry trade that will be going on. There will be an outflow of capital, and the Hong Kong dollar will be weaker. When it touches the weak side of the trading band, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority will have to intervene, and the liquidity in Hong Kong will become tighter, and the interest rate or the interest rate in Hong Kong will rise, and the interest rate differential will narrow, and the carry trade activities will become less pronounced, and that's the design of the whole system. So in the days to come, when we hit the weak side of the trading band, it is likely that the HIBOR will rise, and this, as I said in answer to an earlier question, the activities will happen. I mean, as to whether there is a massive outflow of capital, we do not see this happening. When the interest rate differential become narrow or narrower, then there is less of an incentive to engage in carry trade activities, and there will be less outflow of capital. Lady over here, please. Cable TV. Now, the consumption voucher scheme, how much will it contribute to the improvement in the economic situation, and also export in Shanghai and Beijing? The major ports are still not in normal operation. How long do you think it's going to drag on? Thirdly, with the receding pandemic and also with all these supporting measures, why are you so pessimistic still for the whole year? Now, as regards the consumption voucher scheme, the government is doling out $10,000 in 2 installments. For the first installment, it was issued in April. This will be valid until the end of August. So the consumption vouchers will last a longer period of time this time around. So the support for the economy will not be evident within a couple of months. It will be evident gradually that there will be a support for the economy, in particular for domestic consumption. In terms of the mainland ports, if you look at the development of the mainland pandemic, in March, mid-March, there were about 3,000 cases per day. I didn't look at it yesterday, a couple of days ago. The mid-March, it was something like 30,000. Right now, it is hovering around 2,000 or less than 2,000. So we can see that the pandemic situation in mainland has seen some improvement. Going forward, there is no way I can predict if the pandemic is under control. Then the transportation, logistics disruption will ease. How long is it going to take? It would be really hard to say. A couple of weeks, a couple of days is hard to say.
全年咁頭先點解話消費券又有刺激？
As for the annual forecast, like I said, the consumption vouchers would have a stimulating effect, and the pandemic is receding. Why did we adjust our forecast downward? When we look at the overall environment compared with 3 months ago, I think there were 2 things we had to take note of. First of all, the external environment has deteriorated, and the Q1 performance was worse than expected. That was something we could not change already, and the external environment also worsened compared with February. Factoring in all these reasons, the annual economic forecast is lower by 1 to 2% compared with February. Next question, please. The gentleman over that side. This is from Hong Kong Commercial Daily. First of all, in terms of the GDP forecast, it went from 2 to 3.5% to the latest 1 to 2%. Has it taken into account a possible 6th wave for COVID? If Hong Kong sees a 6th wave within the year, how would the possible extent of decline compared with the 5th wave? For the GDP forecast for April to June this year, compared with Q4 2021, do you expect the forecast to be comparable in terms of the property market, given the rapid rate hikes and the HAMA has been working overtime as a result? Going forward, will there be greater volatility or risks facing the Hong Kong property market. You asked quite a few questions. I would address them one by one. As to whether we have considered the possibility of a sixth wave, our forecast is a range of 1 to 2%. So if certain factors fare worse than expected, then the forecast or the eventual GDP would be closer to 1, and vice versa. First, it would depend whether the possible sixth wave is severe, and it also depends on how we handle a possible sixth wave. And the SAR government has accumulated a lot of experience across the first 5 waves of the pandemic, so we are confident that we can handle it properly. I'm no health expert, but this morning an expert indicated that a sixth wave is not very likely. We have provided a range forecast instead of an exact forecast, since we are only in May and we still face plenty of uncertainties. That is why we offered a range when we deliver an economic forecast. For the property market, we saw that it remained soft in Q1. Prices went down by 3% and transactions were scarce. By March and April, we saw the market stabilize, and that could be due to a recession in the pandemic and potential demand resurfaced as a result. Going forward, I would say that interest rates are a main factor affecting property prices. Of course, the market would also be dictated by economic outlook, people's income, etc. But interest rates are one of the major factors. So if the rate hikes of the US continue, interest rates in Hong Kong would also rise. And I would say that our property market would face certain risks. Interest hikes would affect the economy, financial conditions, and like I said, the mortgage repayment burden would also increase. That is the monthly repayment for those who have taken out mortgages, and this is something we must keep tabs on. Next question. The gentleman in black. This is Ming Pao. According to major banks, their GDP forecast for Hong Kong is minus 0.5%, and they pointed out to weaker than expected investment sentiments, and due to the pandemic, some sectors might continue to come under pressure. So did you forecast, or did you ever consider a recession forecast? Local costs did not face an inflationary pressure, but do you think that an inflation forecast of 1 to 2% is rather optimistic? In terms of investment sentiments, it did not fare well in Q1, and that was owing to the poor economic conditions and sentiments overall. As the local economy, including local demand, gradually picks up pace, the sentiments would also improve. in April, we saw a sharp rebound in the PMI. The SMS index also saw a strong rebound. So if the economy develops like what we expected, we believe investment to pick up as well. In terms of inflation, external price pressures exist, and they are indeed escalating. Underlying inflation would remain inflation since local costs have remained stable. So as a whole, the headline inflation would remain moderate. But if you look at all the components, you could see certain components going up, such as, and some would go down, such as rentals. Rentals are going down at the moment. For energy related items or products, prices might go up substantially. The same for clothing. For foodstuff, much depends on supply. In the first quarter, we saw a rapid rise in the cost of basic food items because of the pandemic and disruptions to transportation, and the prices of fresh foodstuff went up substantially as a result. So it all depends on supply. And the inflationary situation is largely under control, and the forecast is 2%. And many people might realize that the prices of groceries have went up substantially, and that could be true.
Can you elaborate on how the COVID outbreak in mainland China has affected Hong Kong's export and trade, and what is the outlook going forward? Do you still expect it to contract in the second quarter? Thank you.
I think for the export performance of Hong Kong in the first quarter, it's largely due to two reasons. One is the decelerating demand growth in the global economy, and the other is because of the disruptions to transportation, land transportation between Hong Kong and the mainland. But this disruption is largely due to the local epidemic instead of the epidemic situation in China. So looking forward, and the epidemic situation in Hong Kong has stabilized, has in fact improved quite a lot since early April, around that time. And so we expect that if this situation can continue, probably the disruption between land transport, the disruption to land transport between Hong Kong and the mainland may ease a little bit in the coming months. So this should help give some relief to Hong Kong's export performance. But of course, on the other hand, we have seen some deterioration in the global economic outlook. So this will continue to constrain Hong Kong's exports in the coming, say, in the coming few quarters.
Any further questions? Let's make the last question. Lady in black, please. Commercial radio. There is some analysis that shows that the China may not be able to achieve the COVID zero policy, and there will be further restriction, and the supply chain will be disrupted, and Hong Kong's export will be affected. The Fed is hiking the interest rate pretty aggressively, and the interest rate sensitive sectors will be adversely affected. What measures does the government have? Will you lower the whole year's economic forecast? Well, for the pandemic situation in the mainland, as I said, the peak happened in mid-March. There were about 30,000 cases on a daily basis during the peak. And in recent times, The caseload has come down to something like 2,000. And the measures that they have adopted are effective against the pandemic. In some areas, they managed to track the cases, and they managed to keep on top of the pandemic. So in the days to come, will there still be disruptions that would affect the production and also the logistics? That this is not necessarily the case. We don't have any concrete evidence to say that this is going to be the case. Interest rate hikes, as I said, the interest rate hikes would act as a drag on the consumption and on investment. The economic forecast has already had taken into account the interest rate hikes in the US and also the interest rate rise in Hong Kong as well. That's where we end the press conference today. Thank you all very much.